Hey everybody, this is Mr. Moppa coming at you again. This is APUS Governments. Once again, we're taking a look at topic 1.9, which is Federalism in Action. This is part 2 of this video set. And last time we talked about the application of federalism, the idea of sharing government power with regard to environmental policy. And we focused in on the different responsibilities of the legislative and executive branches regarding environmental policy. We talked about the exploits of Theodore Roosevelt. We talked about the passage of numerous environmental laws in the 1970s, such as the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. Today what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how, even though we have this idea that government authority is about sharing power, that does not mean, though, that it does not get into conflict, and there isn't some degree of instability at times regarding policy. So keeping that in mind, I wanted to, once again continue our look at environmentalism. And we said previously that the EPA, which was created in the 1970s, is the executive branch agency that is responsible for the enforcement of numerous environmental laws, such as the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, etc., etc. Now, the EPA has a lot of power and influence. Think about all of the different rules and regulations that go into environmental protection. Now, that being said, the EPA is a controversial industry. Environmentalists tend to like what the EPA does, but many in the business sector have concerns about what the EPA does, and maybe it's too overbearing, too intrusive in commercial endeavors. So with that being said, one example I wanted to turn to that is relatively recent was going back to 2012 when the EPA created some fairly strict emission standards for mercury that fossil fuel companies had to adhere to. Now, these new raised standards, do not come cheap. And you got to understand that when a government agency like the EPA creates an edict using its powers derived from legislation like the Clean Air, and Clean Water Act, when it requires businesses to comply, those things are not cheap. And so in this particular case, these new mercury emission standards are going to cost businesses approximately $10 billion nationally to comply. That is not nothing. And as you can imagine, quite a few businesses across the country were not down with these heightened standards. Now, once again, it's not that these businesses are pro-pollution or anti-environment or anything along those lines. There's just a sense of, how far can and should the government go in the name of environmentalism to limit, private business. Now, understand that just because a law is passed and it is therefore enforced by the executive branch, that doesn't mean that's the end of the story with regards to what can happen to policy. With regards to this particular mercury emission standards policy, we saw lawsuits be created against the EPA that were heard in federal court, eventually making their way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And we saw that the Supreme Court in 2015 found these particular mercury emission standards, and no, we're not going to get into the technical deets regarding this, but basically in this particular case, the Supreme Court ruled that these EPA mercury emission standards that they created were too intrusive, that it went beyond the power of the federal government and created too much of an unreasonable burden on these companies to comply, to be able to adequately run their businesses. We bring this up because in the world of federalism, we do see applied checks and balances. When you do have sharing of responsibilities, you also have to have the ability to limit what branches can do, to check their power so that no one branch becomes all-powerful. If the EPA was not held to account by, in this case, the courts, or held to account maybe by, future legislation passed by Congress, etc., then you would have, a government agency that would, kind of act dictatorial or authoritarian in nature, and may not necessarily be acting in the wishes of the American people. So, the EPA, like anything else in government, has a responsibility, has a good function, but it must be limited for sure. Now, that being said, when we talk about policy, it is not always a coherent thing. Not only do different branches play a role in perhaps altering what government policy may be, we also see its impact at the national versus maybe conflicting state and local levels. And you can even see lack of continuity regarding political parties that play a role in this process, or even individual chief executives. So, for example, when we talk about these disagreements over environmentalism, one example of this would be specifically concerns regarding climate change. Climate change is the fact that global warming is happening, that the Earth is warming up. It has been warming up for many decades now. The vast majority of scientists believe that the reason why the Earth is warming is because of industrialization, the burning of fossil fuels, the impact of the greenhouse effect, which, trap CO2 and has led to more extreme temperatures in recent decades and especially recent years. The last several years have been the warmest years on planet Earth in recorded history. So, with that being said, there has been a growing desire by governments to try to address this. Now, that being said, if this is a global crisis, a global issue, then this is going to require cooperation amongst literally hundreds of independent countries to try to address this. Now, an early attempt to try to create a global standard to try to address climate change would be the 1997 Kyoto Protocol from Japan. This was an attempt to try to have an international treaty, basically, to have global powers reduce CO2 emissions. It was signed by President Clinton, but it did not get ratified due to Senate Republicans that disagreed with it. And remember, treaties require a 2/3 majority in the Senate to be ratified, which means that they almost always have to have a significant amount of bipartisan support, which this did not have. And notes, climate change has been one of the areas of policy that have divided Republicans and Democrats in recent decades. Democrats tending to be more supportive of the idea that we need to have concrete global cooperative efforts to actively reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to try to reduce the rate of global warming that is happening. Republicans have generally been opposed to it for numerous reasons. Some Republicans oppose it due to the idea that global treaties or global agreements limit American sovereignty to be able to make its own choices regarding this particular issue. Some have argued, like for example, previous President Trump, that some of these agreements may place a harsher burden on the United States to comply than other countries, that the responsibility for addressing climate change is not being applied fairly or equally, perhaps. And then there's just others that just don't believe that global warming is the result of man-made action, that is just happening naturally, that it's beyond man's creation, therefore beyond man's control. So there's numerous reasons why Republicans, or at least, and I don't say all Republicans, but many Republicans have been opposed to these kinds of global agreements. Now, that being said, we do see in 2015 President Barack Obama enter into the Paris Climate Agreement, which will be seeing approximately 200 different countries coming together for the purpose of making an agreement to reduce greenhouse gases, to try to keep the rate of warmth for the rate of global warming to be reduced, to have wealthier countries like the United States aid poorer countries in their attempt to try to offset global warming, etc., etc. Now, this kind of an agreement is going to be something that is once again politically divisive, and in particular, Obama's decision to enter into the Paris Agreement was not through the more traditional treaty process like Clinton did, but via an executive order. Now, we really haven't gotten into these, the idea of what an executive order is just yet. We will later on. But basically, an executive order is the way by which a president is able to take legislation or powers that are already in the Constitution or approved by Congress and dictate how those are to be enforced. And I'm not getting into the details of what Obama is going to be utilizing as the constitutional basis whereby he could use an executive order, in this case, to have the U.S. join a global climate agreement, but he will do that. And senators on the Republican side are going to feel that this was an overreach by the president, that he had violated the Constitution using this type of an executive order in this case. But nonetheless, we do sign the Paris Agreement. Now, note, an executive order, since it is not passed by Congress, it is only binding for the length of a president's term in office, which meant that once Barack Obama left office in 2017, it was then up to the next president to decide whether or not the United States was going to continue with the agreement. And in 2017, President Donald Trump will quickly make the decision by executive order to remove the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement, citing that the United States was facing undue burdens and unfair restrictions regarding their responsibility regarding the agreement. So, one president can use that authority to enter into an agreement, and we see another president using that authority to leave from that agreement. Now, note, this was not universally liked to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Liberals and Democrats were strongly opposed to it. And we even saw, some states like California, following President Trump's decision to pull us out of the Paris Agreement, decide to basically create standards at their own level that are in compliance with the Paris Climate Agreement. So this is another interesting example of federalism in action because, because of this division of power, national, state, and local, you might have a national government, a federal government, under the Trump administration that says, we're not going to abide by these rules. But a state on its own, like California, could say, you know what, we do want to abide by these rules. Just because the federal government doesn't want to abide doesn't mean that a state can't choose to abide. And, we saw California do that. Now, note, what's interesting is that, once again, when you have different presidents in office with different points of view and different opinions and perhaps different political party affiliations, you can see, once again, policies regarding a certain area change. And we see this regarding climate change and the Paris Agreement. When President Trump lost his re-election bid in 2020, we see Joe Biden become elected, and on his first day in office, January 20th, 2021, you see here President Biden signing a new executive order to repeal President Trump's executive order, which had repealed President Obama's entering of the United States into the Paris Climate Agreement, which meant that we're back in the Paris Climate Agreement. So, it is important to note how different branches of government, different political parties, can certainly play a role in affecting policy, serving as a check and balance or to just assert a different policy stance, etc., etc. So, remember, when we are talking about government in action, always try to apply it to policy, and we're going to try to do that as we go through, to once again take this from being theoretical and putting some flesh and bone on it to make it real. Okay, so we're going to leave it here for environmental policy, but in our next two videos for topic 1.9, we're going to be applying policy in a different direction, not environmentalism, but to another area, marijuana policy. So that should be interesting. So we'll see you next time for that.